This short video is intended to give you an introduction to our next text and the first assignment from that text. You may remember that when we started Brave New World, we began by looking at a handful of short films to start getting our heads around the notion of dystopia and what kind of patterns we'd be watching for in Brave New World. We're going to do something kind of similar to begin our next book, Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. There you can see the author around 1958 when the book was published, and the cover, which we'll come back to later. Before we read this book, it's important to consider the geographical and historical contexts. The book takes place in Nigeria, and the events of the story are set in the 1890s. The text was actually published, as it says there, in 1958. Now that's worth noting because those are pivotal dates in the history of Nigeria. In 1890, when the book is set, that is just after Britain took control of Nigeria. And we'll look at in a minute, that's part of a wider picture of European countries taking over African land. But the book's publication occurred in 1958, just 2 years before Nigeria again won its independence. If you look at that image at the bottom, and we'll talk about this more in a minute, the red areas there are the areas of Africa that were controlled by Britain during most of the span here from 1890s until the 1950s. And so this is a hugely different historical moment. At the beginning of the text, when the text is set, Britain controls Nigeria, and then when the text is actually published, just after it's published, 40 million Nigerians, it says there, finally have again their freedom. Now, as I mentioned, that the Nigerian experience is part of this wider picture of European nations scrambling to gobble up Africa. As it says here, in 1870, only 10% of Africa was under European control, and by 1914, just a few decades later, 90% was under European control. And you can see that reflected in those images. And the Europeans like to imagine themselves as distinct and different from the nation of Africa. Africa, they like to imagine, was sort of a perverse opposite of Europe, a mirror image. And so they wanted to see themselves as being distinctly different than the people and the way of life there. And you can see this in this introductory image. We have Europe as Britannia is written on that plume on the armored hat of that woman. It represents civilization in opposition to the barbarism of Africa and the African people. So as the caption says, Europeans created an image of Africa that was the perverse opposite of Europe's. And so what I'm going to ask you to do for next time is to look at a handful of images like this one and think and write about not only what's happening in the images, but also what those images suggest about race and culture in conflict. Remember, all the images you're going to see are from the perspective of Europeans who are looking at Africa. And how do they represent themselves, and how do they represent Africa? Those are the questions the assignment's going to ask you to consider about 10 different images. We won't start any reading of the text for next time. We'll do that in the future. But first, this activity will just help you to think about what people knew or thought they knew about Africa when Achebe sat down to write his own story about that place and its people in 1958. And so what will happen is I'll show you an image like this, and then I'll give you a slide to put in on the left-hand side what you see in the image, and on the right, your commentary on what that might suggest or mean. And I've done this first example for you, and I'll send you a set of slides where there are several more images. And after each image, there is a set of boxes for you to record your own ideas. And you can see I've given you some historical context on images when I thought that would be helpful. All right, so I hope that's an interesting and eye-opening assignment, and I'd welcome your questions as you work toward completing it, or just in general about that project.